Well, hey everyone. Welcome into another episode of the Easter Pod. I am your host, Corey Easterday, and today's episode is going to be a shorter solo episode. There's no guest this week, primarily because I didn't fully realize just how exhausted I would be after working on our first 4 episodes, and especially in light of everything going on in the world right now, I just felt like I needed to take a bit of a break, to take some mental health time and rest a little bit and just kind of ease up on the podcast momentarily. However, because of how much I truly love doing this podcast, and because perhaps now more than ever, I wanted to still have a way to connect with all of you, I decided to go ahead and do this episode and put it out there. So before we get into what I'll be talking about today, just a quick reminder that if you haven't already, definitely be sure to check out our first 4 episodes we have up. We've had some really great guests on, and I feel like we've struck a good balance so far between having fun conversation and getting into deeper stuff as well. And as I've said before, ultimately my goal with this podcast has always been to create something that connects with people and helps us all feel less alone and more connected to one another. And I've just really enjoyed connecting with the guests we've had on to this point, and I really hope that you've enjoyed listening to them and connecting with their stories and what they've had to share as well. Also, a quick reminder to follow the Easter Pod on social media, and as always, if you like the show, be sure to give us a rating and a review, and also be sure to subscribe to the show or follow us so that you don't miss an episode. You can find the Easter Pod wherever you get your podcasts, and we appreciate you tuning in. I'm recording this episode on Saturday, March 14th, and I typically don't like to date the pod like that, but I think it provides some helpful context to what I'll be discussing today. Much like everyone listening, I've been processing through the coronavirus, aka COVID-19 outbreak that has been impacting the globe. Just this week, the World Health Organization declared the virus a pandemic. The NBA suspended its season in light of Rudy Gobert from the Utah Jazz testing positive for the virus, and subsequently all sports leagues followed suit with the cancellation of both the men's and women's NCAA tournaments, the MLS suspending its season, the NFL canceling its owners' meetings, the NHL suspending its season. On and on it went throughout the week, with major sports organizations canceling games or canceling events, or postponing them, I should say, in some cases. Not to mention, across the country and around the globe, local and state officials and leaders have been taking action to cancel their events, to close schools, and even, in some cases, cancel church gatherings for the next several weeks. Just yesterday, even, the president declared a national emergency. So you put all of that together, and this was the week that the coronavirus became something that is impacting the daily life of just about every single person around the world. Now, when I was thinking through what to talk about in this solo episode, I had no plans of really getting into the coronavirus, but it's become impossible to not talk about it. However, I think that what I originally had in mind to discuss still very much applies in this situation and is arguably more prescient right now with the ongoing current world events. It doesn't even need to be said that I have no expertise when it comes to public health or this current pandemic, so I'm not really going to discuss the details of it much further, and I strongly encourage you to stay tuned into reputable news sources and experts that do know what they're talking about to get your information. Now, what I'd like to speak about in general, and somewhat through the lens of our current global situation, is what it's like to battle with anxiety and depression. Now again, it may not need to be said, but I'm going to say it. I am not an expert in the mental health field, and the reason I want to be careful about saying that is because I believe strongly in therapy and in seeking treatment for things like anxiety and depression. I even mentioned in our first episode that I'm currently in therapy, and as a result, I believe in directing people who are struggling with mental health issues to the places of treatment where they can get the professional care that they need. What I want to talk about today when it comes to anxiety and depression is my own personal battle with both of those things. I want to have the conversation about anxiety and depression in a way that is helpful to those of you listening and is ultimately not about me using this podcast as a form of therapy for myself, because again, I have a therapist to help me with that, and I always strongly recommend people struggling with any mental health issue to seek treatment or seek a therapist as well. I will be pointing to some resources at the end of this episode, and we'll be linking to those resources in the show notes. So if you are someone who is currently struggling with anxiety or depression or any mental health issue, I encourage you to seek that treatment and lean on those closest to you for help. The reason I'm sharing my personal story and the goal of this episode today is simple. No matter what you are going through or what you are struggling with, I just want you to know that you are not alone. I first thought of this as a topic I wanted to cover last week when I found myself going through a particularly rough experience with depression. It didn't last super long, but when I was going through it, it felt very, very overwhelming. Depression takes on many forms for many different people, and I view for myself depression as being multifaceted in how it can manifest. I myself tend to want to compartmentalize things like anxiety and depression into just one thing, or there's just one cause for it. Like, for example, depression is just a mental thing, or it's just an emotional reaction I'm having. But what I've learned for myself is that it can be those things, but it can also be a physical issue that requires medical treatment. It can be a spiritual issue as well. It can be a direct result of a life circumstance. And honestly, sometimes it can be some combination of all of those things and other factors being mixed in together. I think the danger comes for me when I try to compartmentalize it to one thing or to one causality, or even worse, when I try to minimize it altogether. Now, in the case of this last week, one of the common threads I personally experience when I'm battling depression is that my thoughts become increasingly isolated. I go through a narrative or several narratives in my head where the basic message is that I am, in fact, all alone. When I feel that way, it can be very difficult to feel motivated to reach out to people, and it can be easier to just continue to isolate or to ignore attempts from other people when they do reach out, or to just live in such a way that I'm playing into that narrative. I'm telling myself that I'm all alone. There are many reasons why I feel I've struggled with anxiety and depression throughout my life. In addition to the factors I mentioned before, unfortunately, like so many of you, I've experienced trauma and traumatic events. I've experienced grief. I've experienced heartache, and the list goes on and on. In my line of work, putting together Google ad campaigns for mental health therapists, I've gotten to see firsthand just how many searches come in on Google, and this is just Google, mind you, but how many searches come in every day from all over the country from people seeking to understand and seeking help for their own anxiety or depression, or the anxiety or depression a loved one is going through. It's honestly part of the reason I believe so strongly in the work I get to do helping therapists advertise their services, because it's clear that the need is so great. I haven't told many people about this, and to be honest, I'm pretty hesitant to even share it on this platform, because even though I'm passionate about the subject of mental health, I still sometimes can personally stigmatize it myself and allow it to feel like a shameful subject to talk about. But about 2 years ago, in 2018, when I was at my doctor's for a routine checkup, I mentioned to her that I was going through a particularly rough stretch of dealing with anxiety at that time. Now, I don't know why, but it had never occurred to me before to even mention something like dealing with anxiety or depression to a medical health professional. I'm really glad I did, though, because she ended up walking me through steps to determine just how badly I was struggling from a medical perspective, and as a result of what she determined was right for me as a patient, she had me start on a very light dosage of anxiety medication that I ended up staying on and taking, I think, just about every day for the next year or so. I bring this up because that interaction with my doctor helped me to see these battles from a perspective I'd never considered before as it related to my physical body and how anxiety and depression can have medical effects and causality and how I can help treat that through medicine. That was a time in my life also where perhaps more than any other time, I fully realize that there doesn't need to be a stigma around mental health, anxiety, or depression, and that it's okay to seek treatment in a myriad of ways to help me improve and have better mental health. Part of the problem and stigmatization around mental health for me personally, even though I've had battles with anxiety and depression over the course of my life, comes from the theological perspective I maintained growing up. Again, I have to be clear here that I'm personalizing my experience when it comes to spiritual matters and not laying blame at the feet of any individual or church. In fact, growing up, I had pastors that would work hard to ensure I had access to therapy, so I've always felt lucky in that regard to have spiritual leaders who have helped me seek treatment in other ways outside the church. What I mean specifically is that most of my life, I understood things like anxiety and depression to be more related to or more caused by a lack of faith in God, a personal lack of faith in God, or an attack from Satan, or something that could easily be taken away if I just prayed hard enough. And overall, I just felt like mental health wasn't that big of a deal, that bad mental health was ultimately my fault for some reason, that I had some great control over it, or that some outside force was to blame for both the good and bad times. It wasn't until I became older that I realized so much of the issues I was experiencing with anxiety and depression were not my fault, could not be easily taken away, and that rather than be so afraid of what was going on in my brain, that I could embrace my struggles, lean on other people for help, and seek treatment. I think this is, in part, why so much of the conversation around mental health these days has been about removing the stigma. So many of us grew up in environments where, quite frankly, mental health was stigmatized, and we had experiences in these environments or around people where we were made to feel ashamed for struggling with it, either directly or indirectly. Even more than that, society as a whole has trained us to always put our best foot forward, always present the best, most idealized version of ourselves, and has taught us that only when we present that idealized version of ourselves will we be rewarded with the relationships and the connection that we as humans so deeply desire. And honestly, that in and of itself is something that has given me a lot of anxiety. I've worked really hard my whole life to make sure I'm crafting the best image of myself for others, because growing up, I was not someone who had a lot of friends, and my issues were actually very much on display for everyone to see. So that isolated me from a lot of people. While my classmates were going to parties, playing sports, etc., I was getting suspended from school, getting into fights, acting out in class. Most of that was in middle school, but early high school was still a big-time struggle. And my first real experience becoming less socially isolated and feeling more accepted and having more friends was when I joined a band in 2005 as a 16-year-old high school sophomore. People in general, I felt, started giving me more positive attention. And while I was maturing and seeing legitimate improvements in my mental health, I also started to internalize that people wanting to be around me and be my friend felt really great. And I did everything I could to chase that feeling and to ensure that I would never have to feel isolated. You know, for the last 15 years or so, I have many times found myself working overtime to make sure that like I said, I never have to feel the way I did before I started making friends or started feeling like I was accepted. I didn't want to ever feel that way ever again. When you're working so hard to make sure people accept you and affirm you, it doesn't leave a lot of space to destigmatize and seek treatment for your own personal struggles. You tend to want to hide them more, pretend like they don't exist, or pretend like you're not struggling. And that's why I'm endlessly thankful for the countless people I've had in my life who helped me to identify and work through so many of those issues, and who never let me fully embrace my inauthentic self or hide or pretend like I wasn't struggling. So many people have pushed me to love and accept myself for who I am, with all the good and all the bad. And they did this by setting an example, by loving me and accepting me wholly for who I was, the good and the bad. They accepted me that way themselves. The people that did that as I grew up gave me the courage to not be so afraid or to feel so ashamed of my struggles. And that feeling of being connected in community gave me the strength to openly work on my mental health issues and to talk about them. Which leads me to our current worldwide situation. When I keep repeating in this episode that I want you to remember you are not alone, it's because that simple fact seeping its way into my life is a massive reason I'm in a place where I've gotten to work on improving my mental health and find treatment. If I had grown up continuing to feel unsupported and all alone, I don't know if I would have gained the courage to work on my issues or to speak about them. The people in my life and the positive community I've experienced make up so much of the core of my identity and have translated into so much of my life's work, wanting to give that community to other people, trying to facilitate ways for others to become more connected. Now, as of today, the world is not a place where many of us feel fully safe to connect beyond our immediate family or beyond our home. But that doesn't mean we should allow ourselves to become any less connected or to become disconnected. If anything, I think it means we have to make sure to strive even more to connect, to love, to remember what binds us all together, and to be people who, to steal a phrase from the nonprofit I work for, Current Initiatives, to be people who are dealing hope to other people. So I'll link to this in the show notes, but just today I read an article on CNN's website from writer Katie Hawkins-Garr that was titled "Social Distancing Can't Mean Being Disconnected." And in the article, Katie details creative ways to stay connected during this time of social distancing. I want you to read the article, so I won't go into too much of it here, but the basic suggestions center around finding ways to be a person who connects to others, whether that's chatting with people over Skype or FaceTime, checking in on your neighbors, finding creative ways to help other people, and a bunch more suggestions that she gave. It was an awesome and inspiring article in this time of isolation and uncertainty, and like I said, I really encourage you to read it. Now, in the aforementioned suspension of the NBA season, another great example of being connected is that many players in the NBA, like Kevin Love, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Blake Griffin, and Zion Williamson, among others, are donating money to ensure that the arena workers affected by the suspension of league play are able to still receive pay and won't have to maybe struggle as much. Writer Shea Serrano even started a thread on Twitter where he was helping people to pay their bills. Many of the churches suspending services are doing online services so that they can still gather people together in community. Not to mention people who are helping kids in schools that are currently on hiatus, kids who depend on the free and reduced lunch program. There are people helping the kids and their families by providing meals while school's not in session. I've even seen many people offering to run errands for those who have to remain quarantined. In a time of uncertainty and fear, it's been very inspiring and very encouraging to see people that are taking action to connect to others and provide that spark of hope and to show that love to people however they can. It all reminds me of a quote from Fred Rogers that I saw a friend share today on social media. And the quote says, "When I was a young boy and would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" And that's a very popular quote. And it's a popular quote for a reason, because this is a prime time where it would be easy to hide away and to let that fear and that uncertainty overcome us. But there are just so many people fighting through it to step out on the front lines and help people. And it's just incredible. And all of that, all of those examples and more just embody sort of the credo of this episode. You are not alone. In situations like the one we are currently living in that have the potential to create so much fear, it's so easy to struggle that much harder with issues like anxiety and depression. I know for myself personally, parts of this situation have made my anxiety levels spike, or parts of being isolated have fed into those struggles with depression. But you know what? That's okay. It's okay to struggle. It's okay to feel alone. It's okay to feel scared. It's okay to feel disconnected. I don't think I'll ever stop struggling with anxiety and depression to some degree as long as I live, but it's okay. The goal for me is no longer to live in a world where I'll never struggle, where bad things will never happen. The goal is to remember in those times of personal struggle, or where the world has turned into a scary place, that I'm not alone, and that maybe through my words or actions, I can help someone else feel less alone too. Before I go, as promised, I wanted to share a few resources. If you or someone you know is struggling with anxiety or depression, I will link to these in the show notes, and I would also encourage you to not be discouraged by social distancing, and to remember that there is a lot of online help tailored to help you find treatment right where you're at. Some of the national resources I wanted to mention were the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They have a helpline, and their phone number is 1-800-950-6264. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, they have a number at 1-800-273-8255. And psychologytoday.com has a really helpful tool where you can type in your location and they'll help you find a local counselor. In preparation for this episode, I was even typing into Google things like, where do I find help for anxiety? Where do I find help for depression? Where do I find a counselor? If you're preferring to maybe not call a phone number, but to just search online, basic searches like that, in addition to something like psychologytoday.com, will yield very helpful results to where you can find help in your area. I want to thank you again for tuning into this episode of the Easter Pod. It's very much our most serious and somber episode to date, but I hope that in many ways it was also a very encouraging and a very hopeful episode. Not just the examples I shared of people doing extraordinary things in this time of need and this time of crisis, but I hope it's encouraging to remember that there are resources out there if you are struggling, that you are not alone in what you're struggling through. And ultimately, I'm just grateful we've had this chance to connect as we all practice some social distancing. As we wrap things up, I just wanted to say I hope that each of you out there stays safe. And in the next few weeks, we will be back to having guests come on the Easter Pod. So stay tuned for some great conversations that you won't want to miss. Until next time, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Easter Pod.